Shabbat Shalom again, everybody. We are continuing our studies for today because we have a little more time, and we're going to do another lecture from John Wilson's Our Israelitish Origins. And this is from lecture number 4, The Training of Yisrael or Israel. This is part of scripture. It says, quote, "He found him in a desert land and in the waste howling wilderness. He led him about, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye." And that's a idiom. It really, the Hebrew's literal translation is the little man of his eye, right? As an eagle stirs up her nest, flutters over her young, spreads abroad her wings, takes them and bears them up on her wings. So Yahuwah alone did lead him, and no strange mighty one with him. I do believe that's from Deuteronomy 32. So the subtitles here for what's going to be covered: Yisrael, or Israel's close connection with the three grand families of mankind, the mingling of races, the parent's influence upon his offspring, exemplified in the case of Abraham's posterity, care taken as to the physical properties of the chosen race, the moral training given to Abraham, to Yitzhak, Jacob, Yahusuf, and his brethren, to Yisrael or Israel, in Egypt, in the wilderness, the three grand principles of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. And we don't use a democracy. I know today it's a little muddied up in the definitions because they call our country a democracy, for example, but it's a constitutional republic. And our founders would have found their idea of democracy was a repugnant thing. They had nothing good to say about them. Successively developed Yisrael or Israel in the land under the judges and the kings, Dawid and Shalomo, all have failed in the very respects in which they excelled. Yisrael trained to maritime affairs, preparatory to going forth among the nations. Elohim's purposes with regard to Israel, and for which he had been training them, not accomplished during their former residence in the land, and shall be fully accomplished in the promised kingdom. And we'll start on the right here. I do believe it reads down and then we cover over. It says, Elohim, having chosen a particular family whereby to exercise a great and most extensive influence among mankind, and having appointed them a position the most advantageous, from which to dispense to all the ends of the earth the blessings of which they, in the first place, were to be made the partakers, and having indubitably secured unto them the blessings of the firstborn, by reiterated promise, and even by oath, having chosen Yisrael to be the lot of his inheritance, to be the instructors of mankind, the declarers of his glory unto the nations. He dealt with them accordingly. He brought them near unto himself, and led them about, and instructed them. As a tender parent with a child, he took them by the arms and taught them to go, and gradually strengthened them for the service in which for their heavenly Father and their brethren of mankind they were afterwards to be engaged. He brought them into every variety of situation, enlarging continually their experience, and giving them a sympathy with universal nature. He qualified them for all climes, for meeting with every condition of life, and for laying hold upon all instrumentality, and for the seizing upon every medium through which blessing might be conveyed unto the whole family of Adam. One of the principal means of improving a race, as well as of enlarging its sympathy, is its being to a certain extent intermingled with other races. And the connection of the chosen race with the three grand families of mankind is rather remarkable. The first three generations, by both the father and the mother's side, were entire of the race of Shem. But after this, their connection with the descendants of Ham seems to have been very intimate. And he doesn't know, you all might not remember, but if anyone wants to take the time to look into the book of Yobelim or Jubilees, which we have read already on this channel and we have it all available, it talks about before Abraham or Abram was born, that in the line of his genealogy from Noah to him, you had all three sons' lines intermingled. It was a daughter of Madai that had married into the family from the sons of Japheth, and it was actually a daughter of Nimrod, of the sons of Ham, the son of Cush, the son of Ham, that married Eber, when you go by what's in there. So we'll continue. That's just to show that racism is stupid. We're all literally related, and just because you have different color skin doesn't mean anything. The first three generations by both the father and the mother's side were entire of the race of Shem. But after this, their connection with the descendants of Ham seems to have been very intimate, and that as to both the issues, excuse me, of Yisrael, Yahusef having married in Egypt, and Yahuda took to him a Canaanite. Now, Yahuda and Shimon both took Canaanite women. Shimon repented and married a different one to have children with as well. Okay, the Canaanites were under the ban, but there was the the wife of Yahusef was an Egyptian, and then you remember Moshe was accused by his brother and sister for the fact that he had married an Ethiopian, although we don't have any of his genealogy in that regard that I'm aware of. But it says, and such also seems to have been Tamar, the mother of Pharez and Zerah. She was not of the Canaanites. That was a separate issue, but she was not, she was of Aram or of Shem. A wholesome restriction was put upon this intercourse, but still it seems to have gone forward, and must have had a considerable influence upon the race, adding that strength of domestic affection, for which the descendants of Ham are remarkable, to the superior intellectual and moral constitution possessed by the original stock. After this sojourn among the descendants of Ham, they were, as we shall see, led out among the more vigorous Japhetic race in the north country to have a needful energy given, and the Japhetic race is the Orientals, the Mongol and the Orientals that were both all over Russia. The ones that went to the Far East fled from the Mediterranean when there was paganism and things being promoted there. They didn't want to deal with. But this isn't history that we're taught too much of. Again, it's the post, right after the flood. Very few things that are known. Most of it's mythological, where they ended up worshiping the first few generations of men as false mighty ones. It says they led them out, the more vigorous Japhetic race, in the north country to have the needful energy given to that intellectual power and those sentiments and affections which they previously possessed. It is a fact now abundantly ascertained not only as to the inferior animals with regard to which the principle has been long acted upon, but also as is true with regard to the race of man, that the dispositions and attainments of the parents have in many cases a most important influence upon the capacity and habits of the offspring. The laws which regulate this influence are not yet clearly defined, but there can be in it was what we call epigenetics today. He's talking about the dispositions that you carry down, the traits and features, and it's not just physical. There's quirks on things that I will do that I see in some of my children, and same thing with my wife. Um, Even in my granddaughter will pick at my fingernails anytime she's holding my hand, and that's a thing that only my wife does. So it's an interesting thing, but it carries down in the genes. But not just the good, but also your propensities for pornography, alcohol, any drug use, the good, the bad, the ugly. You pass it down into your children, and that thing is also explained about the proper cultivation of the field before you plant your own seed in the recognitions of Clement. Says the laws which regulate this influence are not yet clearly defined, but there can be no doubt as to the general principle, a principle implied indeed in the very first truths of our religion, in which the moral and intellectual constitution of man is recognized as having been grievously injured by the fall of our first father, Adam. We must distinguish between natural capacity and special divine favor when we speak of the influence of parents upon their children previous to birth. It is of the natural capacity and disposition of which we speak, the and subordinate although this be to the other, yet still it is of vast importance, both as to the happiness of the individual and his usefulness to society. Even where the children are of the same parent, there is often a striking coincidence between the varying disposition of the parent and the permanent disposition given to his different offspring. Thus, Yishmael, born to Abraham after his conflict with the kings at the valley of Shaveh, has given birth to a race delighting in war, whilst Yitzhak, born to Abraham in his old age, after receiving the benefit of his long training and discipline, after all the ignorant evils were rooted out of him in his old age. If you remember, if you pay attention, all the little things that the fearing things and the not getting over stuff, being and whatever, all the things that he was working out to become perfect in, he was held off, I'm sorry, it was held off until he was made perfect. And once these things were rooted out, then the covenant was given and the circumcision was made. And after that, the seed was born to which the benefit would flow. That is an example of the cultivation of the field that is mentioned by Clement, or in the recognitions of Clement there. But it said, manifested, except in one grand instance, much of that subdued and pious character of mind which might have been expected. And if, as some have supposed, the Brahmins to be descendants of Abraham by Keturah, I do believe that's what's in the recognitions of Clement as well. Not all of them, but some of them went to become Brahmins, and then others also joined with the Medes and Persians to become the Persians. And some also mixed with the Ishmaelites as well to become the Arabian people. But they do remarkably manifest the self-possession and willingness to sacrifice the affections through religious motives, which were so conspicuous in Abraham at the time of his offspring, or of his offering up his son Yitzhak upon the altar. In them the principle has been ill applied, but as to the natural feeling, it may be regarded as the same. Even physical beauty and strength were not unattained or unattended to in the choice of the progenitors of the chosen race. The health both of Abraham and of Sarah appears to have been sound. And the various journeys of Abraham, the multifarious duties to which he had to attend, must have required a strong physical constitution, and may also have tended to increase it. There's still in Turkey today 90-year-old men that are shepherds running up and down mountains for taking care of sheep. So it definitely helps you to be fit. His agility is remarked as in the case of entertaining the messengers and the successful pursuit of the captors of his kinsman Lot. The beauty of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and of Rebekah, the beloved wife of Yitzhak, and of Rachel or Rachel, the best beloved wife of Jacob, is very particularly and repeatedly noticed. And we find, as in the case of Yahusuf, of whom the multitudinous seed was to come, that this beauty was not lost to the children of these mothers of Yisrael. From many parts of the scripture we learned that the daughters of Yisrael were fair and comely, and even with regard to the children of Yahudah, whose beauty is not so much spoken of as in that of Yahusuf, much is recorded. And another witness in the ancient history of Caldonia, it explicitly mentions that the daughters of the Hebrews were more beautiful and comely than the daughters of the Egyptians. And it was part of the reason why they were jealous of them. The means taken here, the means taken to preserve health of body and to season, strengthen, and attune the physical powers were indeed remarkably adapted for the purposes intended, and did certainly argue a full knowledge of the natural laws in the guide and lawgiver of Yisrael. These, however, we do not now dwell upon. If personal beauty and bodily activity and strength were attended to in the choice of the fathers and mothers of this particular people, much more may we expect that attention should be paid to their minds, to the improvement and invigorating of their moral and intellectual constitution. One of the first lessons which Abraham had to learn was the proper exercise of faith, an immediate dependence upon the guidance and protection of the unseen El. He was called to go out, not knowing whither he went, nor how he was to be supported and preserved, otherwise than as the Almighty would vouchsafe. At the same time, his hope was brought into the most healthful influence by the many precious promises that were given to him with regard to his seed, and especially with regard to Mashiach's day, which he was permitted to see afar off. And his possession of the land wherein he was a stranger, and of that city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is Elohim. His veneration was given abundant occasion for exercise, not more by the need he had for patient submission to the will of Elohim during the long delay, and the trials which Elohim in his sovereignty allowed him to endure, than by the call for the rejoicing devotion to him, by whom he was ever so singly delivered, and so abundantly blessed. The sentiment of justice was nourished by the sacrifices he was enjoined to offer, as pointing forward to the sacrifice of Elohim's beloved Son, for the sins of guilty men. The lessons of truth were equally impressed upon him by his being shown the folly of duplicity, as in the case of denying his wife, and by his great teachers so wonderfully fulfilling his word to him. By this divine Tovim, or this El-breathed Tovim, goodness, also was his benevolence instructed, and in its exercise he was encouraged, by his being privileged to entertain messengers unawares, and to crown all, he was by his constant ultimate success, after long waiting, excuse me, taught patience in waiting, and perseverance in acting as being made of one mind with the Most High El, who condescended to have fellowship with him, and to call him his friend. True dignity, and yet humble and delighted obedience, might therefore be expected to belong to the character of Abraham. At the same time, his intellect must have been greatly cultivated by his being led into such a variety of scenes and circumstances. It mentions in Sirach that you become intelligent and wise by travel, and you're learning about seeing different things. So, his knowledge of localities must have been greatly enlarged by his travels into by his travels into such a variety of countries. And his individuality, or power of observing and distinguishing objects, was given exercise by coming into contact with various nations, as well as with so many individuals. The various productions of nature and of art in the different countries through which he passed would also help to keep this important mental power well employed. He must have been well acquainted with civil affairs, and we see that he was far from being unskilled in diplomacy, nor was he uninstructed or unsuccessful in war, although only for the sake of peace does he seem to have turned his attention to the sword. Astronomical knowledge, it is likely, he brought with him from the east, and in Damascus and Egypt, and the smaller states between, he had an opportunity of being made well acquainted with the arts and their various productions. In learning the ways of Elohim which were so unfolded to him, his casualty must have been well employed, and his comparison in the illustrating these to others, while commanding his children and his household after him that they should keep the way of Yahuwah to do righteousness and judgment. His powers of intelligence and reflection, no less than the higher sentiments, must by all this have been greatly cultivated. All this training seems to have been not alone for his own advantage, but clearly also for the benefit of his numerous posterity, on account of which he was called Abraham, the father of a multitude, a great and mighty nation, through whom all the nations of the earth were to be blessed. It was not until his mind had attained that maturity which all this training was calculated to afford, that to him Yitzhak, in whom his seed was to be called, was born. In the case of Yitzhak, there seems to have been, in many respects, a repetition of the same trials and travails, the same exercises of belief or faith, and hope, and veneration, and justice, and benevolence, and firmness. Many of the very same incidents seem to have happened in his case, which had occurred in that of his father, and therefore it may be that less is said respecting him. If we may be allowed the expression, there seems to have been in him a conning over the lessons taught to his father. And I think that means going over them again or repeating. His life appears to have passed in greater quietness and in a calm cultivation of personal piety and of the domestic affections, until the waywardness of his affections led him to destroy that domestic peace he seems to have so valued by his endeavoring to thwart the purposes of Elohim as to the bestowment of the blessing. In Yaakov, and he means by that, the Yahuwah foretold in the womb that Yaakov would be the one that gets the blessing, and Yitzhak still intended to give it to Esau. Okay. In Yaakov, another useful class of faculties were called into play, in addition to those already mentioned in the case of Abraham and Yitzhak. These have their organs situated on the side of the head and are mainly prudential. He was early called upon to exert prudence, even in the preservation of his life from the wrath of his brother, after he had by stealth procured the blessing. Prudence also he had to exert in the acquisition, preservation, and management of his property, as well as in the preventing of mischief in his numerous family, or in the assuaging of disputes when they arose. The wisdom he was thus called upon to exercise was no less than the virtues taught his fathers, necessary to be possessed by a people who are to supplant every other, and be made princes in all the earth, justifying their title to the two names given to their father, Yaakov, a supplanter, and Yisrael, prince of El. In the case of, Yahusef and his brethren, Yahuwah seems to have manifested himself less immediately to man, but equally instructive is he by his providence. What a powerful lesson of virtue is given in Yahusef, as triumphing over all the unkindness and powerful treachery of brethren and of strangers, separated from his father's house, and with his true origin unknown. He is put into a position of returning tow for evil and of being a succor in trouble for those who had appointed him unto death and sold him into bondage. His firm resistance of the sentiments or seducements of sin prepare for his being given the control of all that was possessed by the most polished nation then in the world. At the same time, we are shown how his over faithfulness, and I'm still learning about it, but there's a book written by Mary Wyatt, the the widow, the former wife of Ron Wyatt. He had commissioned her to write a book about the information that he found with the battle over the firstborn, about who these Yahusef was in Egypt. And if I remember correctly, they said he was Imhotep. And they have all the records and they show about it in the book there. There's also information online. I'll try to share that as well. But just a connection to the secular history with the truth of what was going on in Scripture here. But at the same time, we are shown how his over faithfulness to Pharaoh in making the Egyptians become slaves for a morsel of bread is rewarded upon his own posterity, who, under the descendants of these same Egyptians, were subjected to cruel bondage. Now, this is attributing fault to someone that our Creator never does. That was a type of thing to show when you don't use your liberty well, you don't get to keep it. And it doesn't matter if you're a pagan or a believer. All the world was subjected to monarchies and put into systems of oppression and tyranny because they would not subject themselves to their maker. The same has been going on throughout history. The same is going on right now in our own country because we will not subject ourselves to the Torah of Yahuwah Elohim. We have man-made rules being oppressed on you, right? But either way. But Elohim overruled this for Tov. Previously to this, the chosen race had only been accustomed to pasturage or tillage, but they were designed to plant cities and dwell in them, and become more concentrated than could be allowed them in the pastoral life. The imaginative or conceptive powers had been greatly called into exercise in the case of Yahusuf by the position in which he was placed in Egypt, where so much depended upon his management. His power of planning seems to have grown almost to the degree of abuse at the time his brethren arrived first in Egypt. But not only was it useful that he should have been given much exercise of that inventive and improving genius, for which his descendants were to be so remarkable, it was also requisite that the race generally should be broken in so as to perform the duties and the labors of more settled life, and accordingly they are laid hold upon by the Egyptians, and are taught by them those arts which it was now requisite for them to possess, such as the making brick and building cities. They are trained to industry and hardship. They acquired by their previous way of life a strong physical constitution, and now it was given abundance of profitable exercise, if not immediately profitable to them, yet certainly to their posterity. At the same time, their moral feelings are educated by their becoming acquainted with the heart of a stranger, so that when given a land of their own, they might deal with the stranger, as they themselves would have chosen to be dealt with. In the same situation, all the while their parent waiting upon Elohim, or their patient waiting upon Elohim, for the accomplishment of his promise, is put to a severe trial. At length Elohim makes bare his set apart arm, and seizes upon the simplest means, the rod of a shepherd, to break the scepter of Egypt, and clear a way for the oppressed through all the difficulties wherewith they were surrounded. They were taught the justice, the wisdom, and the power of Yahuwah in his safely leading Yisrael, his firstborn, through the deep, whilst the enemy sank as lead in the mighty waters. After having been taught all the wisdom and made to feel all the power of Egypt, they are made to see all such to be of no avail in contriving or contravening the purposes of the El of Yisrael. In the wilderness we behold another course of training commenced, connected with their future destination. They are instructed in their religious, social, and personal duties in the most minute particulars. They are led about and habituated to military discipline. They are taught alike personal cleanliness and set apartness of heart. They are taught to put away everything hurtful or unseemly, and to be considerate of each other's welfare and happiness. They are given a body of political institutions, remarkably calculated to teach them order and train them up for independence, for the enjoyment and preservation of their public and individual rights. They are initiated into the forms of a popular government and are taught by the division of their nation into tribes the principles of the Confederation of States. It may be observed that there has been, up to this time, a gradual development of the principles of government, according as they were called for by the condition of the people. In the infancy of the race, whilst they lived as a family under Abraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob, the parithical principle prevailed. Upon the death of Jacob, when the 12 brethren were left pretty equal in authority, the aristocracy or the aristocratical form of government may be said to have existed, and this rule by elders being the heads of families seems to have continued till Yisrael were brought out into the wilderness. And we just mentioned that before. Yahudah was king. It was passed down in trust through his children, but in Egypt, that was lost. Something happened there. Okay. Probably when they were taken into captivity, but it's quite possible that he might have been colluding with the government there that was oppressing the people. I can't say for sure. If you look at the way things happen now and you try to look at what was there before, there might be something to it, though. It says, in the wilderness, the democratical principle was added to their political constitution, as we read Deuteronomy 1 9 through 18. Then were the whole body of the people commanded to look out from among themselves, Tov men and true, who should be appointed officers among them, as rulers of tens, of fifties, of hundreds, and of thousands, so that every matter, great or small, might be instantly attended to and put to rights by men in whom they had confidence, who comprehended the affairs of those they represented, who had wisdom to direct, and who were men known to have integrity, to act according to the best of their knowledge and judgment. Now, to act according to the best of their knowledge and judgment, not just to know what's the best, but to act on it and to have the discipline to stay to. That's what we need to focus on for ourselves, or at least for myself. They were also here given a body of religious rites, remarkably calculated to lead them into a minute knowledge of both nature and art. They could not make those distinctions as to clean and unclean animals, and the different parts of the same animal, as to the different plants and species and ointments, and as to metals and precious stones, without becoming extensively acquainted with natural history. And they could not but become well acquainted to chronological and astronomical observation by their regularly occurring festivals. At the same time, the acquisitions made in Egypt were not to be lost. The perfection of the arts which they had there learned, like the making of weaving, jewelry, the making of bricks, all the useful things that they learned, all the crafts, all the skills. It says was called for in the constructing of the tabernacle and its various important contents, the making of dresses for the Kohanim, the engraving of stones, and the compounding of ointments, and working variously in wood and precious metals. They are taught to work for Yahuwah and to feed at his hand. At once do they see him as the El of creation, of providence, and of redemption, by whom the ordinary laws of nature are overruled, that the people he had ransomed from the hand of the enemy might be delivered and sustained. Elohim is their lawgiver, governor, judge, and guide, a wall of fire around them, and the glory in the midst of them. They're in the quiet of the desert, with all the world shut out, that so their attention might be the more entirely concentrated upon the words of their great teacher and the visible representation of spiritual truths, spiritual truths, which they were as yet too carnal, too much in childhood, otherwise to learn, and which it was important should be impressed upon their imaginations, with all the solemnity, brightness, and power that now accompanied them. Elohim drew near and was himself their teacher. What simple sublimity in the scene! How full of meaning the words that were uttered. Exodus 34, 5 through 7. And Yahuwah descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of Yahuwah. And Yahuwah passed before him and proclaimed, Yahuwah, Yahuwah Elohim, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in tovim and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children, unto the third and to the fourth. The grand course of Elohim's procedure in providence and grace is set before them, both by word and in lively emblems, as when hid in the cleft of the rock, their leader saw thus the El of Yisrael passing by, and proclaiming, Yahuwah, Yahuwah Elohim, merciful and favorable, which he was at the first advent, and in the bestowment of his Son, and of his Ruach. And then he is long-suffering, during the backsliding and wanderings of both the houses of Yisrael, until his second appearing, when he shall be seen as abundant in tovim and truth. Now, that was just an explanation in the parable of how he appeared in Moshe and how the scene at the cleft of the rock, and how that was foretelling the future in order. That same phenomenon is right there in chapter 1 of the book of Hanok, where it has the different ways that Yahuwah is going to appear, and it shows every instance of Yahushua appearing as Elohim to men. The same things were expressed in grand scenic representation when the high Kohen with the blood of atonement was seen entering into the most Kodesh place to appear in the presence of Elohim for the people, who without were waiting for his second appearing. When he came forth, not clad in plain raiment as before, but clothed in garments of glory and beauty, to bless the people in the name of Yahuwah. So our great high Kohen, after having entered into the Kodeshim, or the most set apart of all, not made with hands, and not with the blood of others, but with his own blood, though now gone to appear in the presence of Elohim for us, will, to those that look for him, appear the second time in glory and in majesty, fully to bestow the blessing he has gone to procure. The power of tracing analogies, so essential to them as the intended instructors of mankind, was given thus the highest cultivation, and the whole of their reflective faculties were brought into healthful exercise upon all that Yahuwah had done, was doing, and would do with them. They are taught the origin of the world and the past history of man, to see sin as the cause of all evil, and the Tovim of Elohim as the source of all Tov, or good, to man. They are, as it were, put to school, to learn in lively emblems the justice and the mercy of Elohim, and the future history of their nation and of the world. And their sense of propriety is educated in the most profitable manner by the minute attention they are taught to pay to the set-apart service of religion, to useful, social, and most wholesome private observances. Of the observing powers, that which observes size, which takes notice of proportions and measures the distances, was especially useful to them, as intended to be Yahuwah's measuring line, to compass sea and land for the extension of Elohim's Tovim among men, and the bringing all parts of the world into one grand interchange of blessing. And the provision made of the cultivation of this mental power is abundantly manifest when, in reading the books of Moshe, we observe the minute attention which was to be paid to every sort of measurement, as in the making of the tabernacle and its contents. It may justly be questioned whether there be a single profession or trade or art or science with regard to which profit may not be derived from the diligent perusal and thorough comprehending of the books of Moshe. It is short of the truth to suppose that these books had but the inculcation of one truth in view, however important that one truth may be. Yisrael in the wilderness was in a grand course of training with regard to everything requisite, whether belonging to their physical or moral or intellectual constitution, in order that they should be eminently a seed to serve Yahuwah and be strong for labor in diffusing blessings among men. Having been duly prepared in the wilderness, they are at length brought forward into the land of Canaan, and it is granted them according as is required, and they have a heart to take possession. Moshe and Yahushua are dead, but their king lives and is almighty. They lie exposed to their enemies who surround them on every side, and who give them continual occasion for the vigorous exercise of their minds in defense and in the wise management of their national relations. Their enemies have no power, but when Yisrael themselves give it to them by their rebellion against their heavenly King, they are taught to depend upon the Almighty, who will infallibly protect them in the right and punish them in the wrong. Their judges are his officers, raised up for the occasion. To them the nation must not look, but to that Elohim who has appointed them. If they look to man, they are disappointed and broken. It is now more especially that Yahuwah is training them to go alone. Each individual is, in a great measure, made to think and act for himself. A more powerful or better consolated government among them than that of the judges might have been given to the body of the people more strength, but it would not so much have strengthened the individual character as it was with a regard to this, that Yahuwah was training them much more than for the purpose of giving them present ease as a nation. It was not to make them the useful instruments, or it was not to make them the useful instruments of one man as under an absolute monarchy, but to make them a nation of kings and Kohanim unto Elohim, that he had delivered them from their Egyptian taskmasters. But they did not consider the latter end, for which their Yahuwah was preparing them. They grew impatient of this state of things, and required a king, like the nations around them. He warned them of the evils into which they were plunging, but they were impertinent, and he gave them a king in his anger, and took him away in his wrath. They are again taught, and it mentions that there's actually a scripture that says he gave them a king in his anger and took him away in his wrath. Now that was literally in the land where they depossessed the king when he's doing wrong, like Shaul, like what happened to Zadik Yahu, and etc. All the kings that were wicked that were removed. But it also, in the other sense, the monarchies were taken away when the popular governments came about, and that is literally during the time of his wrath, where you have the bowl judgments being poured out. So, something to consider there. They are again taught the folly of trusting in man. The king who was to combine their scattered energies and lead them forth successfully to battle left them in the hands of the enemy. But Yahuwah has again a bright course of training for them, and to this, the concentrated form of a kingly commonwealth is better adapted, and Dawid is raised up to execute the purpose of Elohim. It would be difficult to name a single faculty of man's mind, affective or intellectual, which was not remarkably manifested in Dawid, who, from feeding his father's flock, was taken to feed the flock of Elohim, the people of Yisrael. His genius with regard to music and poetry was especially remarkable. To this, or to the beautiful appointments in the service of Elohim, addressed to the eye and chiefly administered by Moshe, he added those which were no less necessary and instructive, addressed to the ear, and the songs of rejoicing are sung, which anticipate the glory of Mashiach's kingdom, when the song of salvation shall resound throughout the world. The character of Dawid's powerful mind appears to have been indelibly, indelibly, impressed upon the nation. He was indeed an eminent type of the king of Zion. And it says, it's witnessed of him in the Dead Sea Scrolls that he was like the light of the sun and in his intelligence and wisdom, right? Both his sufferings and in his triumphs, Dawid, whose name means beloved, seems to have been eminently distinguished for reigning in the affections of his people. When this throne was taken from him, as by Absalom stealing away the hearts of the people, he refused to remain in his throne at Yerushalayim and withdrew himself therefrom until the people voluntarily called the king back. And the Redeemer shall be given the throne of his father Dawid in both respects. His people, quote, shall be willing in the day of his power, unquote, when he shall send the rod of his strength out of Zion, unquote. But the kingdom of Mashiach is, or Messiah, sorry, is to be eminently a kingdom of shalom, or peace, and wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of his times. The sapphire, the heaven assimilated throne in which the king shall reign over the earth, is seated upon a body of brightness like the terrible crystal, or like to the terrible crystal. And that was the firmament, sapphire blue, awesome like crystal, crystal like ice, to be specific. It says, as if to represent this peaceful light, the true support of powerful love, Shalomo, the peaceful prince, the wisest of mortals, is raised up to give the widest range to the observing and the deepest tone to the reflective faculties. He gives a grand example of the temple of knowledge to be filled with the glory of Yahuwah, and he is permitted to rear that wondrous type, the temple at Yerushalayim, holding forth the great mystery of righteousness and embracing so many lessons of love and of set apartness, but as if to teach the utter folly of learning upon or leaning upon an arm of flesh and putting implicit confidence in any man in the things of Elohim, this their greatest king and the wisest among men was allowed to fall into the very dregs of folly. And he leads the way in the spiritual adultery of the nation. He seems also, by elevating the monarchy, to have lowered the people as to their standing in the commonwealth, and to have oppressed the nation he was given to protect, and whose capital he was gliding with foolish magnificence, or gilding rather with foolish magnificence, making it only the more tempting a prize for the enemy. Thus also was his father, the man after Elohim's heart, left to fall into the most base and revolting of crimes. Thus was Moshe, the meekest of men, guilty of the greatest impatience. Thus also do we find righteous and benevolent Yahusuf, the preserver of nations, guilty of one of the greatest public wrongs, and sweeping calamities, in leading one of the most highly improved nations into a state of even personal slavery, putting them into such a position as that any political change would be esteemed by them a gain. Now, again, he's ascribing wrongdoing to someone where it's not ever admitted anywhere in Scripture. And I would caution everyone from doing anything like that. Anyone who's been accounted as righteous or the friend of Elohim, you're not to say that they're doing wrong things like that. If they do something that's offensive to the Almighty, he would correct them, like he does with every one of them when they do so. This was never corrected. It was foreshowing the principles that I mentioned in liberty and captivity, going along with our obedience to the truth. But it also was foreshadowing the truth of things, where Yahusuf was being used by Pharaoh as the second hand to bring all things into captivity for him, was foreshadowing his children later on being used by Rome to do the same thing. And while he was pious and righteous, not all of his children have been that are doing those things. And that is where this is applicable. But otherwise, I would be very cautious about attributing the wrong to Yahusuf himself. And it's the same thing with Abraham, too, where there is no Torah, there is no sin, is what's explained in the renewed covenant. So before we have instructions, whatever they might have done that is now prohibited, was not held against them. But let's go ahead and continue. It says, Thus was Jacob so generally without guile, guilty of the grossest deception, and thus was pious and affectionate Yitzhak guilty of an attempt to frustrate the purposes of Elohim. In a most material point, occasioning thereby the greatest domestic confusion and bereavement. And thus did faithful Abraham so little trust his Elohim as even deliberately to deny his bosom companion. And thus was righteous Lot found halting after being so signally delivered from Sodom. And thus was Noah, or Noach, also an object of shame to his own children, after resisting a world of unrighteousness, and being so wonderfully preserved from that destruction which overwhelmed it. How instructive is the history of Yisrael, and indeed of the world. And it is world history. It is peculiarly our history, though. How insistent in commanding to, quote, cease from a man whose breath is in his nostrils, unquote. That very quote is meant to be in regard to the little horn, or the Bishop of Rome. You find that quoted in chapter 2 of the Gad of Seir, directly relating to him. And I would encourage everyone to read that for themselves. Trust you in Yahuwah forever, for in Yahuwah is everlasting strength, or for in the Master Yahuwah is everlasting strength, unquote. And, quote, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall, unquote. That's a renewed covenant quote from Shaul. The kingdom of Yisrael had been rapidly attending to an elevated position among the nations, and it might have been supposed, had matters so progressed, that now was come the expected glory. Men might have been in danger of mistaking the type for the thing typified, but in no such danger were they left. It is too plain that the purposes of Elohim with regard to Yisrael were not at all accomplished or consummated whilst they were under the kings, and the religious state of the people had greatly degenerated before the death of Shalomo. And when this was the case, their political happiness could not long abide. Immediately the kingdom divided. That house of whom the one promised seed, Mashiach, was to come, remaining attached to the family of Dawid, whilst the house of Yahusuf, that of which the multitudinous seed was to come, erected a new kingdom for themselves under Jeroboam. An ignoble termination was thus made to so glorious a beginning, plainly intimating, and this point in history, with the northern kingdom separated and then the future captivity, this is the cutting off of his body in the world. When he died in the third day in the evening, it was representing this part of history where his body was being killed. That part I didn't see so clearly until more recent times. And the restoration of his body after the third day before the millennial reign is all what was foretold and what he walked out for us as well. So an ignoble termination was thus made to so glorious a beginning, plainly intimating that this people had not yet arrived at that for which they were so long under such a careful course of training. Ephraim was separated from Yahudah, not only in a political, but also in a religious respect. Both houses were, during the reign of their respective kings, taught many severe lessons as to the unprofitableness of departing from Elohim. Still, Elohim was dealing with them in kindness and preparing them for their different destinies. The Yahudim, who are not designed to be a maritime people, but a kind of universal medium of communication among mankind by land, were given an entirely inland position, whilst Yisrael, who were still more extensively to be a band of union to the race of man, who were to be spread unto the most distant isles, were before being taken out of their land, and even from the time they entered it, in the most careful manner, taught maritime affairs, not only as possessing the small sea of Galilee, but by their being placed all along the upper border of the great or Mediterranean Sea. And in connection with such perfect masters of those matters as were the inhabitants of Tyre and Zidon, by whom also their architectural taste had already been considerably improved. And we've covered before how the inhabitants of Tyre and Sidon were Hebrews in dispersion at that time when they were in league with them. It wasn't children of Ham. They were captured or bought out by that time. The keeping of contemporary chronicles of their own and other nations, the art of war, and the power of making expeditions by sea, and of planting colonies, and of keeping up an extensive correspondence with distant parts of the world, were especially necessary for them to possess. And all this was in the kind of providence of Elohim, prepared for them before the final breaking up of their nation, when for the misimprovement of their many great privileges, they were cast out and left to become wanderers among the nations. They had been instructed in all that they could receive at home, and had now to go forth on their travels, to learn that in foreign countries, with toil and trouble, which they would not be taught by more peaceable means at home, Nor should we forget that they were thus to suffer for the good of others. The casting away of them was to be the riches of the nations, and the restoring of them shall be like life from the dead. Quote, He will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities, and you will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. For you will perform the truth to Jacob, and mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn unto our fathers from the days of old. Unquote. The most cursory view of the known history of Yisrael may convince that they cannot be found among an inferior or even stationary people. They were ever in a state of transition, ever passing from one or on from one lesson to a higher in the school of their great teacher. And in them eminently the saying was to be filled, quote, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it, unquote. Their symbol is the palm tree that brings forth fruit in old age. They shall be fat and flourishing, to show that Yahuwah is upright, my rock, and in him is no unrighteousness. And that is the end of Psalm 33 right there. Quote, This people have I formed for myself. They shall show forth my praise. Unquote. They were vessels afore prepared unto glory, mentioned by Shaul. Some made unto glory, some made of no value, right? And were subsequently to be called in order that they might be fully fashioned and used according to the Tov purpose of Elohim. This was to be accomplished not only with regard to a portion of those that, under the name of the Yahudim, remained in the land, but more particularly as to the house of Yisrael, who were lost, that they might become the riches of the nations, and who were cast away for the reconciling of the world. As yet, when the gifts and calling of Elohim are manifested in Yisrael, shall be realized this glad prediction of Yeshayahu or Isaiah, chapter 32, verses 1 through 5. Quote, Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and a prince shall rule in judgment, and a man shall be as a hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, and as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. And the eyes of them that see shall not be dim, and the ears of them that hear shall hearken. The heart also of the rash shall comprehend knowledge. The tongue of the stammerer shall be ready to speak plainly. The vile person shall be no more called liberal, nor the churl said to be bountiful. Unquote. And I believe that is the end of our lecture there. So thank you all for your time on that. I hope and I pray that it is edifying for you and that you can see the things that our forefathers and we are meant to be trained in by the word and its use. So thank you all for your time. You have a great rest of your Sabbath and a Shavua Tov.